Eleanor stepped off the train expecting her fiancé's embrace, but found only his orphaned son standing alone, his eyes filled with suspicion and desperate hope. "Would you still have come if you'd known about me?" the boy asked, his question cutting through her shock like a knife as her carefully planned future disintegrated into the dust of Montana territory. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The train whistle pierced the afternoon air as Eleanor Blackwood gathered her skirts and stepped onto the wooden platform of Silver Creek Station. Dust motes danced in the golden sunlight that slanted across the weathered planks. The journey had been long, 3 days by rail from Boston to this remote corner of Montana territory, but the excitement that had sustained her through the grueling trip now fluttered like hummingbird wings in her chest. She had sold everything for this moment. Her mother's china, her father's books, the small inheritance that had kept her modestly comfortable after their passing, all of it exchanged for a one-way ticket west and the promise of a new beginning with a man she had fallen in love with through the careful penmanship of his letters, James Everett. The name itself felt like a prayer on her lips. For 18 months, they had corresponded through a matrimonial advertisement column. His words had painted vivid pictures of the life they would build together, a sturdy ranch house with blue gingham curtains, fields of wheat that rippled like an ocean in the wind, and evenings spent reading poetry by lamplight. In his last letter, he had finally asked her to come, to be his wife, to share his life on the frontier. "Miss, your luggage, miss." The porter's voice drew her back to the present. Eleanor smiled gratefully as he set her trunk beside her, its brass fittings gleaming in the sun. A single trunk, all that remained of her former life. "Thank you," she said, pressing a coin into his weathered palm. He tipped his cap and disappeared back into the train's belly, leaving her alone on the platform. Or nearly alone. Eleanor scanned the handful of people milling about, searching for the face she had memorized from the daguerreotype James had sent. Strong jaw, kind eyes, a smile that reached beyond the constraints of the photographic process. But he wasn't among them. A nervous flutter replaced the excitement in her stomach. Had he forgotten? Had something happened? The station was smaller than she'd expected, little more than a wooden structure, with a ticket window and an overhanging roof. Beyond it, she could see the dusty main street of Silver Creek, a saloon, a general store, a small church spire in the distance. The town looked exactly as James had described it, yet his absence made it all seem suddenly foreign and forbidding. Eleanor took a deep breath, smoothing the travel wrinkles from her best grey dress. The fabric felt too heavy in the western heat, another reminder of how far she was from the cool New England springs she had known all her life. She had chosen the dress carefully for this moment, wanting to look her best when James first laid eyes on her. "You must be Miss Blackwood." Eleanor turned at the unfamiliar voice. A man approached, not James, but older, with a badge pinned to his vest and eyes that had seen too much of the world's harshness. "Sheriff Thomas Harding, ma'am." He removed his hat, revealing a shock of silver hair. "I've come to meet you." The flutter in her stomach turned to lead. "Where is Mr. Everett?" she managed, her voice barely audible over the train's departing whistle. The sheriff's expression softened with a sympathy that made her blood run cold. "There's been an incident, ma'am, 2 weeks ago. Fever took him quick. Doc Simmons did what he could, but..." He trailed off, letting the unspoken truth hang in the air between them. The world tilted beneath Eleanor's feet. James was dead. The future she had sacrificed everything for had died with him. She reached blindly for something to steady herself, finding only the empty air. "I'm truly sorry, ma'am." The sheriff caught her elbow, guiding her to a nearby bench. "We only found your letters yesterday when we were setting his affairs in order. I thought it best to meet you myself." Eleanor nodded numbly, unable to form words as grief crashed over her in waves. All those carefully written pages, all those dreams exchanged across thousands of miles, gone. She had gambled everything on a love built of paper and ink, and now she sat destitute in a strange town with nothing but a trunk of useless finery. There's something else you should know, Miss Blackwood." Sheriff Harding cleared his throat uncomfortably. Mr. Everett left behind a son. Eleanor's head snapped up. A son. In none of his letters had James mentioned a child. How old? 10. Name's William. Goes by Will. The sheriff glanced over his shoulder. He's here. For the first time, Eleanor noticed the small figure standing a few yards away, half hidden in the shadow of the station house. A boy with James's jawline and serious eyes that seemed to belong to someone much older. He wore a small holster on his hip, not unusual for a boy raised on the frontier, and stood with his hands clasped behind his back, studying her with an intensity that made her heart constrict. His mother passed when he was 4, the sheriff continued quietly. James raised him alone. The boy's been staying with me and the missus since. He didn't finish the sentence. Eleanor swallowed hard, trying to reconcile this new reality with the life she had imagined. James had never once mentioned a son in his letters. Why had he kept Will a secret? Had he feared she would reject his proposal if she knew? The thought stung that he hadn't trusted her enough to share this most important part of his life. "Does he know who I am?" she whispered. "He knows his pa was writing to a lady back east. That's about all." Eleanor nodded, gathering what composure she could. She had come west to be a wife. Instead, she was faced with being a stranger to a recently orphaned child, a child whose existence had been hidden from her until this moment. The sheriff motioned to the boy, who approached with measured steps, his boots making hollow sounds on the wooden platform. Up close, the resemblance to James was even more striking. The same cleft in his chin, the same way of holding his shoulders square even in moments of uncertainty. "Will," the sheriff said gently, "this is Miss Blackwood. She's come all the way from Boston." The boy regarded her solemnly, his eyes taking in every detail of her appearance, the city clothes, the polished shoes impractical for Western life, the small gold locket at her throat. Then he extended his hand with a formality that broke her heart. "Pleased to meet you, ma'am," he said, his voice steadier than it had any right to be for a child who had just lost his father. Eleanor took his small hand in hers, feeling calluses no 10-year-old should have. "I'm very pleased to meet you too, Will," she replied, surprised at the steadiness of her own voice. For a moment, they stood like that, two strangers connected by a man neither of them would ever see again. Then Will dropped her hand and stepped back, his expression unreadable. "Miss Blackwood," he said finally, the words coming out in a rush as if he'd been holding them in. "Did Pa tell you about me in his letters?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications a child shouldn't have to contemplate. Eleanor hesitated, caught between honesty and kindness, aware that her answer might determine the foundation of whatever relationship they might build. Before she could respond, Will asked another question, the one that would change everything. "Would you still have come if you'd known about me?" Eleanor felt the weight of Will's question press against her chest. The boy's eyes, so much like his father's, held a wisdom and wariness no child should possess. In that moment, she realized he wasn't just asking about himself. He was asking if she was the kind of woman who would have accepted his father's whole truth. "Yes," she said softly, the word emerging before she could fully consider its implication. "I would have come." Something flickered across Will's face, relief perhaps, or skepticism. He studied her with that unnerving intensity, as if searching for the lie behind her word. "Most ladies don't want to raise another woman's child." Eleanor knelt, bringing herself to his eye level, despite the dust that would surely stain her dress. "I came here to build a life with your father. You are part of that life." The words felt right as they left her lips, even as she wondered at their truth. Would she have come if she'd known? The question echoed in her own mind. Sheriff Harding cleared his throat. "Miss Blackwood will need a place to stay, Will. We should head into town." Will nodded, his small shoulders squared with responsibility. "Pa's house is ready. I've been keeping it up." Eleanor glanced at the sheriff, who rubbed his weathered neck uncomfortably. "It's not what you might be used to, ma'am, but it's solid. James built it himself." He hesitated. "Of course. You're welcome to stay at the hotel until you decide." What comes next? What comes next? The phrase hung in the air, heavy with implication. Eleanor had spent her last dollar on the train ticket, confident that James would be waiting. Now she stood on the precipice of destitution in a town where she knew no one. No one except a solemn-eyed boy who watched her with his father's face. "I'd like to see the house," she said finally, straightening her spine. "If Will doesn't mind showing me." The boy's expression remained impassive, but he nodded once. "I can take her, Sheriff." "You sure, son?" The sheriff's concern was evident. "Miss Blackwood has had a shock. Might be better if—" "It's all right," Eleanor interrupted. "I'd like to see where Will's father lived." She smoothed her skirts, trying to reclaim some composure. "Perhaps Will and I should get acquainted." The sheriff looked doubtful but nodded. "I'll have your trunk sent over. The ranch is about 2 miles outside town." He hesitated again. "Miss Blackwood, about James's affairs. There are matters we should discuss, perhaps tomorrow, when you've had time to rest." Eleanor nodded, though rest seemed an impossible prospect. Her mind raced with calculations. How long her remaining coins would last, where she might find work in a town this size, whether she could afford passage back east if it came to that. As if reading her thoughts, Sheriff Harding added quietly, "The stage only comes through once a week. Next one's due Thursday." He didn't need to clarify his meaning. He was giving her an exit strategy, a way back to whatever remained of her old life. "Thank you, Sheriff." Eleanor gathered her reticule and parasol, the last vestiges of her Boston propriety. "Will, shall we?" The boy turned without a word and began walking, his back straight, his stride purposeful. Eleanor followed, acutely aware of the stares from the few townspeople milling about the station. News traveled fast in small communities. By nightfall, everyone would know that James Everett's mail-order bride had arrived too late. They walked in silence down the main street, Will a few paces ahead, Eleanor struggling to keep up in her impractical shoes and heavy skirts. The town was smaller than she had imagined from James's descriptions, a single street of weathered buildings, most built of rough-hewn timber that had silvered with age and sun, a mercantile, a saloon, a small dress shop, a blacksmith. Beyond them, the endless expanse of prairie stretched toward distant mountains. "Pa said Boston has buildings taller than trees," Will said suddenly without turning. "Said they got street lamps that light up the whole night." Eleanor felt a pang at the mention of James's word. "Yes, some of the buildings are quite tall, and the gas lamps make the streets almost as bright as day." She paused. "Did your father tell you much about Boston?" Will shrugged. "Some. Said it was too crowded. Too many people living on top of each other." He glanced back at her. "Why'd you leave it?" The directness of the question took her aback. Eleanor considered how to answer, how much to reveal to this child she had just met. "I was alone there," she said finally. "After my parents died, there was nothing to keep me." "So you answered Pa's ad." It wasn't a question. "Yes." She watched his small back, the way his hand rested near the holster at his hip, not threatening, just habitually close. "We wrote letters for over a year." Will nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "I knew about the letters. Found him writing them late at night sometimes. He wouldn't let me read them, though." They had reached the edge of town. The dirt road stretched ahead, winding through rolling grassland dotted with wildflowers. In the distance, Eleanor could make out scattered homesteads, small houses and barns standing defiant against the vast wilderness. "It's another mile," Will said, gesturing ahead. "Pa's place is just beyond that ridge." Eleanor glanced down at her boots, already scuffed and dust-covered. "Lead on, then." They continued in silence for several minutes before Will spoke again. "Miss Blackwood." "Yes, Will, if you're staying, you should know something." He slowed his pace slightly, allowing her to draw alongside him. "Pa wasn't always honest in those letters." Eleanor's heart stuttered. "What do you mean?" Will kicked at a stone in the road. "He told me once that ladies back east want to hear certain things, that you have to paint a pretty picture to get them to come." He glanced at her sideways. "The ranch isn't as big as he probably said, and the house, it's just 4 rooms." Eleanor absorbed this, wondering what other disappointments awaited her. "I see. And there's no blue curtains," Will added, his voice softer. "Ma had started making some before she died, but they never got finished." The mention of the curtains, the very detail that had captured Eleanor's imagination in James's letters, made her throat tighten. How many other dreams had been constructed from half-truths? "Will," she said carefully, "I didn't come for curtains or a big house. I came because your father's letters made me believe we could build a good life together." The boy studied her face with that unnervingly adult gaze. Pa believed that too. knew. He cleaned the whole house before he got sick. His voice caught slightly. Said everything had to be perfect for when his Boston lady arrived. They crested the ridge, and Eleanor saw it, a small cabin with a barn alongside, nestled in a gentle hollow. Smoke rose from the chimney, and a few chickens scratched in the yard. It was modest, far more so than James had described, but something about its solitary dignity against the vast landscape made her heart catch. "Someone's there," she said, noticing the smoke. Will nodded. "Mrs. Hollister from the next farm over. She's been coming by to help out since Pa died." He hesitated. "She'll want to know if you're staying." Eleanor looked down at the boy beside her, this child who had lost everything and still stood straight-backed and clear-eyed. Then she looked at the small house that James had prepared for her arrival, an arrival he hadn't lived to see. "And what do you want to know, Will?" she asked softly. The boy met her gaze directly. "I want to know if you meant what you said back at the station, about still coming if you'd known about me." Eleanor held Will's gaze, understanding that her answer might shape both their futures. In Boston, she had been skilled at saying what others wanted to hear, a necessity for a woman of reduced circumstances navigating society's expectations. But here, with this child's unflinching eyes upon her, such artifice felt impossible. "I meant it," she said finally. "Though I won't pretend I'm not frightened by the prospect. I've never been a mother." Will considered this, his expression thoughtful. "Pa wasn't always a father either. He told me once that you figure it out as you go." He turned toward the cabin. "Come on. Mrs. Hollister makes good biscuits." They walked the remaining distance in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As they approached, Eleanor took in the details of what might have been her home, the small vegetable garden fenced against rabbits, the weathered porch with a single rocking chair, the chopping block with neatly stacked firewood. James had been preparing for her arrival in his own way, even as he'd embellished the truth in his letters. The door swung open before they reached it, and a stout woman with iron-gray hair stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Her expression shifted from curiosity to something like pity as she took in Eleanor's travel-worn appearance. "You must be the Boston lady," she said, her voice neither warm nor cold. "I'm Margaret Hollister." "Eleanor Blackwood," Eleanor replied, suddenly conscious of how out of place she must look in her Eastern finery. Mrs. Hollister nodded once. "Sheriff sent word you were coming." Her eyes flicked to Will. "You tell her everything, boy." Will straightened. "Yes, ma'am." The older woman's expression softened slightly. "Come inside, then. Food's ready, and you both look like you could use it." The interior of the cabin was dim after the bright sunlight, and it took Eleanor's eyes a moment to adjust. When they did, she found herself in a tidy room that served as both kitchen and living area. A rough-hewn table with 4 chairs occupied one corner, a cast-iron stove another. A patchwork quilt hung on one wall, the only decorative touch in an otherwise utilitarian space. It's not much," Will said quietly beside her, watching her reaction. "But Pa said you'd fix it up nice." Eleanor swallowed the lump in her throat. "It's very efficient," she managed. Mrs. Hollister snorted softly as she moved to the stove. "James always did have more dreams than sense, filling that poor girl's head with notions." "Mrs. Hollister," Will protested, but the woman waved him off. "No point sugarcoating now. She's here and has to decide what she's doing." She gestured toward the table. "Sit, both of you. Food won't wait." Eleanor sank gratefully into a chair, her legs trembling from the long walk and the emotional toll of the day. Mrs. Hollister placed bowls of stew before them, followed by a plate of biscuits that sent steam rising into the cool air of the cabin. "Thank you," Eleanor murmured. "It's very kind of you to look after things." Mrs. Hollister shrugged as she took her own seat. "Neighbors look after neighbors out here. Has to be that way." She fixed Eleanor with a direct gaze. "Now, what's your plan, Miss Blackwood?" The bluntness of the question startled Eleanor. In Boston, such directness would have been considered the height of rudeness. Here, it seemed, practicality trumped social niceties. I haven't had time to consider my options fully," she admitted. "Options are few," Mrs. Hollister said flatly. "Stage back east if you've got the money for it. Work at the hotel or saloon in town. If you don't, Or her eyes flickered to Will, who was focused intently on his stew. Or stay here, Eleanor finished quietly. Mrs. Hollister nodded. The boy needs someone. James left the place free and clear, but it takes work to keep it going. She paused. Or he was managing with Will's help, but it's no job for a child alone. Will's shoulders stiffened. I can manage, he said, his voice tight. I've been doing Pa's chores since he got sick. Mrs. Hollister's expression softened. No one doubts your capability, William, but your father wouldn't want you to carry it all. Eleanor watched the exchange, seeing the pride and grief warring in Will's face. What exactly does managing entail? She asked carefully. Chickens need feeding twice daily. Garden needs tending. Cow needs milking morning and night. Wood needs chopping. House needs keeping. Mrs. Hollister ticked off the tasks on her fingers. Winter's coming in a few months. That means preparations, preserving food, stocking supplies, patching any weak spots in the roof or walls. The list was daunting. Eleanor had never milked a cow or chopped wood in her life. Her domestic skills extended to embroidery and piano playing, accomplishments valued in Boston drawing rooms, but utterly useless on the frontier. I see, she said faintly. Don't scare her off before she's even slept a night, Mrs. Hollister, Will protested, showing the first flicker of something like hope Eleanor had seen in him. The older woman snorted again. A better scared now than desperate later. Winter's no joke out here, especially for city folk. They ate in silence for several minutes. The stew was hearty and flavorful, the biscuits light despite their rustic appearance. Eleanor found herself ravenous after the long journey and the emotional turmoil of the day. These are delicious, she said, taking a second biscuit. Mrs. Hollister nodded acknowledgement. James mentioned you were a school teacher back east. That right? Eleanor hesitated. In his letters, James had asked about her teaching experience, and she had responded truthfully that she had tutored cousins and neighbors, children. She had never claimed to be a professional teacher, but apparently James had drawn his own conclusions. I've taught children, yes, though not in a formal school, she clarified. Mrs. Hollister seemed unsurprised by this half-truth. Well, Silver Creek's been looking for a teacher. School's been empty since Miss Jenkins married the blacksmith from Promise Creek last spring. Might be something to consider. Hope flickered in Eleanor's chest. Teaching was something she could do, even if she couldn't milk cows or chop wood. Does the position come with accommodations? Small room above the schoolhouse, Mrs. Hollister confirmed. Nothing fancy, but it's warm. Will's spoon clattered against his bowl. But then who would stay here? He asked, his voice carefully neutral. With me, the question hung in the air, and Eleanor saw Mrs. Hollister watching her reaction closely. This was the crux of it, not just whether she would stay in Silver Creek, but whether she would take on the responsibility of a child she had never known existed until today. Will, Mrs. Hollister said gently, if Miss Blackwood takes the teaching position, we would find arrangements for you, perhaps with us, or with the Millers. They've always been fond of you. Will's face remained impassive, but Eleanor saw his knuckles whiten around his spoon. I belong here, he said quietly. This is Pa's place, our place. Eleanor looked around the small cabin that James had prepared for her arrival, for their life together. It was nothing like the grand homestead he had described in his letters, yet there was something honest in its simplicity, something that spoke of hard work and hope. Perhaps, she said slowly, there might be a third option. She met Will's gaze across the table. If I were to take the teaching position, but continue to live here with Will, would that be permitted? Mrs. Hollister raised an eyebrow. You'd make that 2-mile walk twice daily, in all weather, if necessary. Eleanor straightened her shoulders. It would allow me to contribute to our keep, while Will and I determine what comes next. Our keep, Will repeated softly, testing the words. Mrs. Hollister studied Eleanor with new interest. You're not what I expected, Miss Blackwood. Eleanor smiled faintly. I suspect I'm not what James expected either. She turned to Will. What do you think of this arrangement? It would be temporary until we get to know each other better. Will seemed to be weighing her words carefully. You'd come back every night, not just stay in town. Yes, Eleanor promised. Every night, the boy nodded slowly. I think Pa would like that. That night, after Mrs. Hollister had departed with promises to return, the next day, Eleanor stood in the small bedroom that was to have been hers and James's. Will had shown her to it with solemn ceremony, explaining that his father had built a new bedstead just 2 months prior, sanding the pine until it was smooth as river stone. He wanted everything to be nice for you, the boy had said, his voice catching slightly before he retreated to his own small room off the kitchen. Now alone in the quiet darkness, Eleanor allowed herself to fully feel the grief and disorientation that she'd been holding at bay since the sheriff's announcement. She sat on the edge of the bed, a sturdy frame with a fresh straw mattress, covered by a handmade quilt, and finally let the tears come. She cried silently, mindful of the thin walls and the boy who might hear, but the tears flowed nonetheless for the future that would never be, for the man she had known only through ink and paper. When the tears subsided, she rose and unpacked her meager belongings by lantern light. Her trunk had arrived as the sheriff promised, delivered by a taciturn young man who tipped his hat respectfully before disappearing into the gathering dusk. From it, she withdrew a nightgown, a hairbrush, and a small leather-bound volume of poetry that James had sent her. Wordsworth, his favorite. She traced the embossed cover, remembering how he had marked certain passages that reminded him of the Montana landscape. A soft knock at the door startled her from her reverie. "Miss Blackwood?" Will's voice came through the rough-hewn pine. "Are you all right?" Eleanor hastily wiped her cheeks. "Yes, Will. I'm fine." A pause. I thought maybe you were crying." She closed her eyes briefly, composing herself. It's been a difficult day." Another pause. "Pa said it's all right for men to cry sometimes, when things hurt real bad." The simple statement, delivered in his serious voice, brought fresh tears to Eleanor's eyes. "But your father sounds like a wise man." "He was." The words hung in the air, heavy with shared loss. Then, "I made some tea. Mrs. Hollister says it helps with sleep." Eleanor opened the door to find Will standing there in a nightshirt that was slightly too small, revealing bony wrists. He held a steaming cup with careful concentration, his face solemn in the lantern light. "That's very kind of you," she said, accepting the offering. The chipped mug was warm against her palm, the tea fragrant with what smelled like wild mint. Will nodded, then hesitated, shifting his weight from one bare foot to the other. "Pa used to read to me before bed," he said finally. "From that book." He nodded toward the volume of Wordsworth on her bed. Eleanor looked from the book to the boy, understanding the unspoken request. "Would you like me to read something tonight?" Will shrugged with elaborate casualness. "If you want to." "I'd like that," she said gently. "Why don't you choose a poem?" He nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "I'll get ready." 10 minutes later, Eleanor sat perched on the edge of Will's narrow bed, the book open on her lap. The boy was tucked beneath a worn quilt, his hair still damp from washing his face. The small room was Spartan but tidy, with a wooden chest for clothing and a shelf holding a few treasures. A polished stone, a carved wooden horse, a tarnished pocket watch. "This one," Will said, pointing to a page he clearly knew well. "Only it was Pa's favorite." Eleanor smiled as she recognized "I wandered lonely as a cloud," the poem James had quoted in his third letter to her when describing the wildflowers that carpeted the Montana prairie in spring. She began to read, her voice soft in the quiet room. Will watched her face as she recited the familiar lines, his expression a mixture of grief and comfort. When she finished, he nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "I've heard you read it just like Pa did," he said, "with the same up and down in your voice." "He must have read it to you often," Will nodded. "When Ma died, he said the poems helped him remember that beautiful things still exist even when you're sad." He paused. "Do you believe that?" Eleanor considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think your father was right. Beauty doesn't take away the sadness, but it reminds us that there's more to the world than our grief." Will's eyes, so like James's, studied her face in the lantern light. "Pa said you were smart in his letters." A flush of pleasure warmed Eleanor's cheeks. "Did he talk about his letters to you?" "Sometimes." Will's fingers played with the edge of the quilt. "He said you wrote about books and ideas, that you weren't like other ladies who just wrote about clothes and weather." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "He said you had gumption." Eleanor laughed softly. "Gumption? Well, I suppose that's a compliment. It is, Will confirmed. Pa always said gumption was worth more than gold out here. He yawned suddenly, the events of the day catching up with him. Eleanor rose, placing the book on his shelf. Sleep well, Will. We'll talk more tomorrow. She was almost to the door when his voice, smaller now with encroaching sleep, stopped her. Miss Blackwood, I'm glad you didn't get back on the train today. The simple statement caught her off guard. I'm glad too, she replied, surprised to find she meant it. Morning came early on the frontier. Eleanor woke to rooster calls and the sound of movement in the kitchen. For a disorienting moment, she forgot where she was, reaching instinctively for the familiar contours of her narrow bed in Boston. Instead, her hands met rough linen and the sturdy pine frame James had built for their marriage bed. Reality crashed back. James was gone, and she was alone in a cabin miles from the nearest town, with a child who was now essentially in her care. Panic fluttered in her chest, but she forced it down. One day at a time, she told herself, just get through today. She dressed quickly in her simplest dress, a navy cotton that buttoned down the front and pinned her hair in a practical knot. Her more elaborate Boston dresses would be useless here. She would need to adapt her wardrobe as she adapted herself to this new life. In the kitchen, she found Will already dressed and tending the stove fire. A pot of coffee bubbled, filling the small space with its rich aroma. Good morning, she said, trying to infuse her voice with more confidence than she felt. Will glanced up, nodding. Morning, coffee's almost ready. Pa liked his strong. I'm sure it will be perfect. Eleanor moved to the window, taking in the view of rolling grassland bathed in early morning light. What chores need doing first? Will seemed surprised by the question. You don't have to. If I'm staying, I need to learn, she interrupted gently. I won't be much use otherwise. The boy studied her for a moment, then nodded. Chickens need feeding first, then the cow needs milking. He hesitated. I can show you how. I'd appreciate that. They worked together in the cool morning air, Will demonstrating tasks with patient precision beyond his years. Eleanor followed his lead, determined to master each chore despite her initial clumsiness. The chickens were easy enough, scattering feed and collecting 4 brown eggs from the nesting boxes. The cow proved more challenging. You have to be gentle but firm, Will explained, demonstrating the rhythmic pulling motion. Like this. Eleanor's first attempts produced nothing but the cow's irritated lowing and Will's poorly concealed amusement. But by the 10th try, a thin stream of milk pinged against the metal bucket. I did it, she exclaimed, her triumph comically disproportionate to the meager results. Will's face broke into a genuine smile, the first she'd seen from him. Not bad for a city lady, he acknowledged. You've got good hands. The unexpected compliment warmed her more than seemed reasonable. They were just finishing breakfast when Mrs. Hollister arrived, accompanied by Sheriff Harding. The older woman surveyed the morning's accomplishments with approving nods, while the sheriff shifted uncomfortably, hat in hands. Miss Blackwood, he began, I've come about those matters we discussed yesterday. James's affairs. Eleanor set down her coffee cup. Of course. Perhaps we could speak privately. She glanced at Will, who immediately stood. I'll go check the fence line, he said, with a maturity that broke her heart. Pa said it needed mending on the north side. When the boy had gone, Sheriff Harding cleared his throat. James left everything in order, legally speaking. The deed to the property, his bank account, what there is of it, all designated to go to Will upon his death. But with Will being a minor, there needs to be a guardian. Eleanor finished. The sheriff nodded. James named his brother Thomas in his will. Problem is, Thomas moved to California 2 years ago. We've sent a telegram, but who knows when or if he'll respond. I see. Eleanor's mind raced. And in the meantime, the court would normally appoint a temporary guardian. He met her eyes directly. Given the circumstances of your arrival and your relationship to James, you could petition for that role. Temporarily, of course, until Thomas responds, or until more permanent arrangements can be made. Eleanor stared at the sheriff, his words hanging in the air between them. Temporary guardian. The role was so far beyond what she had imagined for herself just days ago when she boarded the train in Boston with a heart full of romantic notions about married life on the frontier. I'm not sure I'm qualified, she said finally. I've only just met Will. Mrs. Hollister snorted softly from her position by the stove. Nobody's qualified to raise someone else's child, Miss Blackwood. You just do it anyway." Sheriff Harding nodded. "Margaret's right, and it would only be temporary, just until Thomas responds or until you—" He hesitated. "Until I decide whether to stay permanently," Eleanor finished for him. "Yes, Ma'am." The sheriff rubbed his neck uncomfortably. "There's also the matter of James's finances. I won't sugarcoat it, there's not much. About $40 in the bank in town. The property's paid for, and there's enough livestock and supplies to get through winter if you're careful, but not much beyond that." Eleanor absorbed this information, trying to calculate what it meant for her future, for their future. Her own funds were virtually non-existent. She had spent nearly everything getting to Montana. What about the teaching position Mrs. Hollister mentioned? Pays $30 a month during the school term, which runs September through May, the sheriff confirmed. Not a fortune, but steady work. The town council's eager to fill the position before fall term starts. Eleanor nodded slowly. "And if I were to become Will's temporary guardian, would I be permitted to use some of James's money for our immediate needs? For food and such? As his guardian, yes. You'd manage those funds on Will's behalf." The sheriff's expression softened. "It's a lot to consider, Miss Blackwood. No one would blame you if you decided it was too much." But Eleanor could hear the unspoken judgment in his voice. In a town this small, she would forever be the woman who abandoned James Everett's orphaned son when he needed her most. More importantly, she would have to live with that knowledge herself. "May I have some time to think about it?" she asked. "And to discuss it with Will. This affects him most of all." Sheriff Harding nodded, relief evident in his face. He'd clearly expected an immediate refusal. "Of course. The judge only comes through town once a month anyway. He'll be here next Wednesday." He rose, settling his hat back on his head. "I should get back to town. Mrs. Hollister, you need a ride?" The older woman shook her head. "I'll stay a while longer. Miss Blackwood might need help with dinner preparations." When the sheriff had gone, Mrs. Hollister turned to Eleanor with a knowing look. "You've already decided, haven't you?" Eleanor sighed. "Is it that obvious? You wouldn't still be here if you hadn't." Mrs. Hollister's tone was matter-of-fact, but not unkind. "And you'd have been on that eastbound stage." "I'm terrified," Eleanor admitted. "I know nothing about raising a child, especially one who's just lost his father, and I'm practically a stranger to him." Mrs. Hollister's weathered face softened slightly. "That boy's had more grief in 10 years than most have in a lifetime. Lost his mother when he barely knew her, and now his father." She paused. "But he's strong. James raised him well. He seems so self-contained," Eleanor said. "So careful with his emotions. Frontier children grow up fast," Mrs. Hollister replied. "Too fast sometimes, but they're still children underneath it all." She moved to the stove, lifting the coffee pot. "Now, let me show you how James kept the household accounts. If you're taking this on, you'll need to know what you've got and how far it needs to stretch." They spent the next hour going through a small leather-bound ledger James had kept, documenting every purchase and sale with meticulous care. Eleanor was surprised by the detailed record. James's letters had portrayed him as more dreamer than pragmatist. He became more practical after Caroline, Will's mother, died. Mrs. Hollister explained as if reading her thoughts. "Had to, with a child depending on him." The ledger confirmed Sheriff Harding's assessment. The household was solvent, but far from prosperous. James had sold enough eggs, milk, and occasional livestock to keep them fed and clothed, but there had been little left for extras. The most recent entries showed purchases Eleanor recognized from James's letters to her: new curtain material, the pine for the bedstead, even a bottle of cologne from the mercantile. "He was preparing for you," Mrs. Hollister said softly. "Every spare penny these last few months went to making the place nice." Eleanor swallowed the lump in her throat. "He didn't have to do that." "No, but he wanted to." Mrs. Hollister closed the ledger. "James Everett was a good man. Not perfect, mind you. He had his faults like any other, but he loved that boy something fierce, and he was ready to love you too." Through the window, Eleanor could see Will mending the fence, his small figure bent in concentration over his task. "I never even met him," she said softly. "James, how can I possibly take his place in Will's life?" "You don't," Mrs. Hollister said firmly. "No one can replace James, but that boy still needs someone, and for whatever reason, You're the one who's here. Eleanor nodded slowly. I'll speak with Will this evening. Mrs. Hollister departed after lunch, leaving Eleanor with instructions for preparing the stew she had started and a promise to return the following day. The afternoon passed in a blur of unfamiliar chores, feeding animals, weeding the garden, learning the rhythms of a household so different from any she had known. Will worked alongside her, patient with her mistakes, and quietly pleased when she mastered a new task. By sunset, they were both exhausted, collapsing at the kitchen table to eat the stew that had simmered all afternoon. This is good, Will said after his third spoonful, almost like Mrs. Hollister's. Eleanor smiled at what she recognized was high praise indeed. I followed her instructions exactly. They ate in comfortable silence for several minutes before Eleanor gathered her courage. Will, there's something I'd like to discuss with you. The boy looked up, wariness instantly returning to his features. You're leaving? No, she said quickly. Actually, quite the opposite. She set down her spoon. Sheriff Harding spoke with me about your situation, about who will look after you until your Uncle Thomas can be contacted. Will's expression closed like a shutter. I don't need looking after. I can manage the place myself. I know you're very capable, Eleanor said carefully, but legally, you need a guardian until you're of age. Uncle Thomas won't come, Will said flatly. He and Pa didn't get along. Haven't seen him since Ma died. This was new information. I see. Well, in that case, it's even more important to have arrangements in place. She took a deep breath. The sheriff suggested that I might become your temporary guardian, just until more permanent arrangements can be made. Will studied her face. What does that mean? Guardian. It means I would be legally responsible for you, for your welfare and education. She hesitated. As for managing the household and whatever funds your father left, would I have to do what you say? Like you're my ma? The directness of the question caught Eleanor off guard. I would never try to replace your mother, Will, or your father, but yes, I would be the adult responsible for you, which means sometimes you would have to follow my guidance. Will pushed his stew around with his spoon, considering, would we stay here? In Pa's house, yes. And I would still take the teaching position in town, as we discussed. The boy was silent for a long moment. Then, why would you do it? You don't even know me. Eleanor considered her answer carefully. Because I made a promise to your father, even if he didn't live to hear it. I promised to come here and build a life with him. You're part of that life, the most important part he left behind. Will's eyes, so serious and old for his years, searched her face for any sign of insincerity. What if Uncle Thomas does write back? What if he wants me to go to California? Then we would have to consider what's best for you, Eleanor said honestly. But until then, we can look after each other. If you're willing, Will returned to his stew, taking a few bites as he processed her words. Finally, he looked up. Pa would have liked this, you being here. It wasn't quite acceptance, but it was something close. Eleanor felt a curious lightening in her chest. Then it settled. Will nodded once, decisively. I'll show you how to milk the cow properly tomorrow. You still squeeze too hard. The next week passed in a blur of activity as Eleanor settled into life at the Everett homestead. Each day brought new challenges. The cantankerous cow that refused to be milked by anyone but Will. The mysterious workings of the cast-iron stove that seemed to have a mind of its own, the endless battle against dust that infiltrated every corner of the small cabin. But each day also brought small triumphs. Her first successfully baked loaf of bread, the row of beans she weeded without pulling up a single plant, the evening she managed to light the lamps without assistance. Through it all, Will remained her patient teacher, his initial wariness gradually softening into something like cautious acceptance. He was still guarded, still careful not to show too much emotion, but occasionally Eleanor caught glimpses of the child beneath the solemn exterior. A flash of pride when she mastered a task he'd taught her, a barely suppressed smile when she told a story from her Boston life, a moment of unguarded joy when a family of rabbits appeared at the edge of the garden. On Wednesday morning, they rode into town together on James's elderly mare, Penny. Eleanor had donned her best remaining dress, a dove grey cotton with minimal bustle, for her appointment with Judge Wilson. Will sat behind her, his small arms circling her waist as they traveled the now familiar road to Silver Creek. Remember, he instructed, as the town came into view, tie Penny at the hitching post near the water trough. She gets thirsty easy. I'll remember. Eleanor promised, touched by his concern for the animal. In just a week, she had learned that Will's careful attention extended to all the creatures in his care. The chickens each had names. The cow received gentle words of encouragement during milking, and even the barn cats were greeted individually each morning. The town was busier than it had been on her arrival day. A wagon loaded with supplies stood outside the mercantile, and several horses were tied along the main street. Judge Wilson, Sheriff Harding had explained, traveled a circuit of small towns in the territory, bringing court proceedings to communities too small to support their own judiciary. His monthly visit was always something of an event. They dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, where the proceedings would be held. Eleanor straightened her skirts nervously while Will tended to Penny, ensuring she was properly secured at the hitching post with access to water. Sheriff Harding met them at the door, nodding approval at their prompt arrival. Judge Wilson's just finishing up the Petersons' boundary dispute, he explained, leading them into the small building. Shouldn't be long now. The office had been transformed for the occasion. The sheriff's desk had been cleared of its usual papers and positioned at the front of the room, like a judge's bench. Several chairs were arranged facing it, a few already occupied by townspeople whose business had brought them before the court. Eleanor recognized Mrs. Hollister, who gave her an encouraging nod, and a few faces from her brief walk through town the week before. A tall man with spectacles and a neatly trimmed beard approached them, extending his hand to Eleanor. "Miss Blackwood, I'm Herbert Taylor, chairman of the school board. Sheriff Harding mentioned you might be interested in our teaching position." Eleanor shook his hand, grateful for the distraction from her nerves. "Yes, Mr. Taylor. I've had experience tutoring children in Boston, and I would be very interested in discussing the position." "Excellent." Mr. Taylor beamed. "We've been without a teacher since spring. The children are getting positively wild. Could you stop by the schoolhouse after your business here? It's just down the street. White building with the bell tower." "Of course," Eleanor agreed, glancing down at Will, who was listening to the exchange with interest. "And this must be young William Everett," Mr. Taylor said, turning his attention to the boy. "I knew your father. Good man. He was quite proud of your reading abilities, as I recall." Will straightened slightly at the praise. "Thank you, sir. Pa taught me from his books. Well, perhaps you'll be joining our school soon." Mr. Taylor raised an inquiring eyebrow toward Eleanor. "We'll certainly discuss it," she replied diplomatically, not wanting to make decisions about Will's education without consulting him first. The door to the sheriff's private office opened, and a harried-looking couple emerged, followed by a distinguished older man in a black coat. Judge Wilson had the stern countenance Eleanor associated with jurists, but his eyes were kind as they swept the room and landed on her and Will. "Sheriff, is this the Everett guardianship matter?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle for his imposing frame. "Yes, Your Honor, this is Miss Eleanor Blackwood and William Everett." The judge nodded. "Come through, please." The proceeding itself was remarkably straightforward. Judge Wilson reviewed the documents Sheriff Harding had prepared, asked Eleanor a few questions about her background and intentions, and inquired whether Will had any objections to the arrangement. Throughout, his manner remained kind but serious, making it clear that he considered the welfare of the child his primary concern. Until we hear from Thomas Everett, this temporary guardianship seems the most sensible solution," he concluded, signing the papers with a flourish. "Miss Blackwood, I'm granting you guardianship for a period of 6 months, with the understanding that it may be terminated earlier if Mr. Thomas Everett returns to claim his nephew or if other circumstances warrant a change." He peered at her over his spectacles. "Do you understand these terms?" "I do, Your Honor," Eleanor replied, feeling the weight of the responsibility settling on her shoulders. "Very well, young man," he addressed Will directly. "You're to mind Miss Blackwood as you would your father, is that understood?" Will nodded solemnly. "Yes, sir." "Good." The judge stamped the document and handed it to Sheriff Harding. "File this properly, Sheriff. Miss Blackwood should have a copy for her records." He rose, signaling the end of the proceeding. "I wish you both well. These arrangements are never ideal, but sometimes they're the best we can do in difficult circumstances." Outside, the bright sunlight seemed at odds with the solemnity of what had just transpired. Eleanor stood on the boardwalk, the copy of the guardianship papers clutched in her hand, feeling slightly dazed by the swiftness with which her life had been redirected. "Are you all right, Miss Blackwood?" Will asked, studying her face with concern. She smiled, touched by his consideration. "Yes, just a bit overwhelmed. It's been quite a week." She tucked the papers into her reticule. "Oh, shall we go see the schoolhouse before we head home?" Will nodded, though with less enthusiasm than he'd shown for returning to Penny. "Do I have to go to school? Pa taught me at home." "We'll discuss it," Eleanor promised. "I'd like to see the school first, and then we can decide what's best together." The Silver Creek schoolhouse was a simple structure with a surprisingly charming interior. Rows of wooden desks faced a larger teacher's desk at the front of the room. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the slate blackboard and the few educational charts hanging on the whitewashed walls. A small staircase led to the promised room above, a plain but adequate space with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a bookshelf. Mr. Taylor showed them around proudly, explaining that the school served about 20 children of various ages from the town and surrounding farm. The teacher was expected to develop lessons appropriate for all levels, from beginners to those preparing for possible further education. The salary is $30 monthly, as Sheriff Harding may have mentioned, Mr. Taylor explained. The room upstairs is included, along with basic furnishings. Term begins in 3 weeks. He hesitated. "I understand your situation is unusual, Miss Blackwood, with your guardianship of young William. The board is willing to be flexible about your living arrangements, given the circumstances." "That's very kind," Eleanor replied. "I intend to continue residing at the Everett homestead and make the journey to town daily." Mr. Taylor looked doubtful. That's quite a commitment, especially when winter comes. The roads can become impassable." "I've considered that," Eleanor said, more confidently than she felt. In truth, she had given little thought to the practical challenges of Montana winters. "We'll make arrangements as necessary." Will, who had been examining the classroom's collection of books with interest, looked up. "Pa had a sleigh for winter. It needs fixing, but I know where the parts are." Mr. Taylor smiled. "Your father was always resourceful, William." He turned back to Eleanor. "The position is yours if you want it, Miss Blackwood. The board is desperate enough, forgive my frankness, that we're prepared to accommodate your unusual circumstances." Eleanor glanced around the classroom, trying to imagine herself at the teacher's desk, guiding young minds through their lessons. It was far from the life she had envisioned when she boarded the train in Boston, but perhaps it could be a good life nonetheless. "I accept," she said firmly. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Taylor." As they walked back to where Penny was hitched, Will was uncharacteristically quiet. Eleanor glanced down at him, concerned by his pensive expression. "Is something troubling you, Will?" He kicked at a stone on the boardwalk. "If you're teaching all the children, who's going to look after our place during the day? The animals need tending, and the garden." Eleanor hadn't considered this aspect of their arrangement. "I suppose you could come to school with me," she suggested. "We could tend to the morning chores before we leave, and the evening ones when we return." Will's face fell. "But who would watch over things? Pa always said a homestead needs eyes on it." It was a valid concern, one that highlighted how little Eleanor still knew about frontier life. "Perhaps Mrs. Hollister would have suggestions," she said finally. "We'll ask her tomorrow." Mrs. Hollister, as it turned out, had several suggestions, none of which initially appealed to either Eleanor or Will. The most practical was to sell most of the livestock and simplify the homestead's operations until spring, an option Will flatly rejected. Another was to hire one of the Miller boys to tend the place during school hours, but the cost would consume much of Eleanor's teaching salary. "There is a third option," Mrs. Hollister said finally, after watching Will's increasingly stubborn expression. "Though it's not without its challenges." They were sitting at the kitchen table the day after the guardianship hearing, steam rising from cups of chicory coffee. Through the window, Eleanor could see the first hints of autumn touching the prairie grasses, a subtle shift from green to gold that spoke of the changing season. "What's that?" Eleanor asked, willing to consider any reasonable alternative. "Will could attend school in the mornings, then return home midday while you continue teaching the afternoon session." Mrs. Hollister stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "Many farm families do similar. Send the children to school when they can be spared from chores. Keep them home when they can't." Will perked up at this suggestion. "I could ride Penny back and forth on my own. I've done it plenty of times. Eleanor frowned. I'm not sure about you making that journey alone, Will. I'm 10. He replied, with the indignation only a child can muster when their competence is questioned. Pa let me ride to town by myself all last year. Mrs. Hollister nodded. It's not uncommon, Miss Blackwood. Frontier children grow up with more responsibilities than you might be used to back east. Eleanor considered the proposal. The idea of Will traveling alone worried her, but she also recognized that her Boston standards might not apply here. The boy had clearly been raised with considerable independence, and stripping that away might do more harm than good. What about winter? She asked. Mr. Taylor mentioned the roads becoming impassable. By the time heavy snow comes, you'll have learned enough about this place to make adjustments, Mrs. Hollister said confidently. But maybe Will stays home more days. Maybe you both stay in town occasionally if a storm threatens. Folks here are flexible out of necessity. Will watched Eleanor anxiously, clearly hoping she would agree to this compromise. After a moment's consideration, she nodded. We could try it, at least, on a provisional basis. The boy's shoulders relaxed, relief evident in his face. I'll take good care of everything, he promised. You won't have to worry. But of course, Eleanor did worry. Over the next 2 weeks, as they prepared for the start of the school term, she fretted about all the things that might go wrong. Will could fall from the horse or encounter predators or fail to complete the necessary chores or any of a dozen other calamities her imagination conjured. Her concerns must have been obvious, for one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of amber and gold, Will said quietly, Pa worried too, you know, about leaving me alone sometimes. Eleanor glanced at him, surprised by the observation. Did he? Will nodded, idly whittling a piece of pine with the small knife James had apparently given him for his last birthday. He said worrying just means you care about something worth caring about. The boy kept his eyes on his whittling, the curls of wood falling to the porch floor. He worried about you coming here too. Said he wasn't sure he had told you enough about how hard it can be. The simple statement caught Eleanor off guard. What do you mean? Will shrugged. Just that he would write his letters late at night sometimes, and I'd hear him pacing. Once I asked him what was wrong, and he said he was afraid you'd arrive and wish you'd never come. He glanced up, his eyes serious in the fading light. That's why he fixed up the house so much. Why he bought the curtain fabric and built the new bed. He wanted it to be nice enough that you wouldn't leave right away. Eleanor's throat tightened. In his letters, James had always seemed so confident, so certain of their future together. The image of him pacing by lamplight, worrying that his home wouldn't be good enough, added a dimension to the man she'd never known in life. Your father's letters made me feel like I already belonged here, she said softly. Even before I arrived, Will considered this, his small hands continuing their steady work on the wood. Do you feel like you belong now? For real? It was a profound question from a child so young, and Eleanor gave it the consideration it deserved. Did she belong in this small cabin, in this vast landscape so different from the crowded streets of Boston? Did she belong in the role of guardian to a boy she was still getting to know, of teacher to children whose lives and experiences were so different from her own? I'm beginning to, she answered honestly. It's not what I expected, but few important things in life are exactly what we expect. Will nodded, as if this made perfect sense. Pa said something like that too, after Ma died. These small glimpses into James's thoughts and words were precious to Eleanor, helping her form a clearer picture of the man who had brought her across the country with his letters. Your father was a wise man. Not always, Will said with a hint of a smile. He once tried to milk the cow from the wrong side and got kicked clean across the barn. Eleanor laughed, delighted by this imperfect, human detail. You must miss him very much. Will's smile faded, and he nodded, returning his attention to his whittling. Every day. They sat in companionable silence as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared. Eventually, Will held up his carving, a small, surprisingly well-crafted horse. For you, he said, extending it toward Eleanor. So you'll remember what Penny looks like when I'm riding her home from school. Eleanor accepted the gift with genuine appreciation, running her finger over the smooth curves and detailed features. It's beautiful, Will. Thank you. The boy ducked his head, but not before she caught the pleased flush on his cheeks. "Pa taught me." Said his pa taught him too. "A family tradition, then." Eleanor examined the carving in the dim light. "Perhaps someday you'll teach your own children." Will nodded solemnly. "And maybe you could teach them to read poetry, like you do for me." The simple statement, with its implicit acknowledgement of a shared future, warmed Eleanor more than she could express. Instead of responding with words, she simply placed her hand on Will's shoulder and gave it a gentle squeeze. The first day of school arrived with clear skies and a crisp breeze that hinted at the approaching autumn. Eleanor rose before dawn to prepare, her stomach fluttering with nerves. She had spent the previous evening organizing her lessons and gathering the few books they had for teaching materials, but she still felt woefully unprepared. Will, in contrast, seemed entirely unconcerned. He went about his morning chores with his usual efficiency, then disappeared into his room, emerging in his best shirt with his hair slicked down with water. "You look very handsome," Eleanor said, smiling at his efforts. Will shrugged, though he seemed pleased by the compliment. "Pa said first impressions matter." They rode together on Penny, Will in front this time, demonstrating his horsemanship skills with quiet confidence. The town was bustling when they arrived, children and parents converging on the schoolhouse from various directions. Eleanor recognized some faces from her brief visits to town, but most were strangers, eyeing her with the natural curiosity reserved for newcomers. Mr. Taylor greeted them at the schoolhouse door, beaming with relief. "Miss Blackwood, right on time. Children, gather round and meet your new teacher." 20 pairs of eyes turned toward Eleanor, ranging from openly curious to warily suspicious. The children varied in age, from what appeared to be 5 or 6 to teenagers nearly grown. All wore practical clothing, many showing signs of careful mending, and all had the sun-browned complexions of those who spent much of their time outdoors. "Good morning," Eleanor said, summoning a confidence she didn't entirely feel. "I'm Miss Blackwood, and I'm very pleased to meet you all." A small girl with braided blonde hair raised her hand immediately. "Are you really from Boston?" "Jimmy says people from Boston talk funny." A ripple of giggles moved through the group, and a red-headed boy, presumably Jimmy, looked mortified. Eleanor smiled. "I am indeed from Boston, and perhaps I do sound a bit different to your ears, just as you might sound different to someone from Boston." "My pa says Boston folks think they're better than everyone else," called a lanky boy from the back of the group. Mr. Taylor frowned. "A Robert Miller? That's hardly a proper greeting." Eleanor met the boy's challenging gaze directly. "I can't speak for all Boston folks, Robert, but I came west because I believed there was something valuable to be found here, something worth leaving everything familiar behind for." She glanced at Will, who was watching her intently. "I believe I was right." The first weeks of school passed in a blur of activity. Eleanor quickly discovered that teaching 20 children of varying ages and abilities was far more challenging than tutoring her cousins had been. The older students tested her knowledge at every opportunity, while the younger ones required constant attention to keep them focused on their lesson. By the end of each day, her voice was hoarse and her patience stretched thin. Yet there were moments of genuine satisfaction, the dawning comprehension on a child's face when a difficult concept suddenly made sense, the tentative hand raised to answer a question, the gradual shift from suspicion to respect in her students' eyes. Will attended the morning sessions diligently, his serious demeanor setting him apart from his more boisterous classmates. At noon, while the other children ate their lunch under the large cottonwood tree outside the schoolhouse, he would mount Penny and ride back to the homestead, his small figure gradually disappearing into the rolling landscape. Those daily partings never failed to knot Eleanor's stomach with worry, though she knew the route was straightforward and Will had traveled it countless times. She couldn't help imagining all manner of disasters befalling him. Each afternoon, as the younger children practiced their letters and the older ones worked on arithmetic, her mind would wander to the homestead, picturing Will tending the animals or working in the garden alone. "You've got to stop fretting about that boy," Mrs. Hollister told her bluntly one Sunday after church. "He's more capable than most grown men I know." "James saw to that." "I know," Eleanor admitted, watching as Will chatted with the Miller boys near the church step. "It's just, he's only 10. Mrs. Hollister's expression softened slightly. "Age means different things out here than it does back east. Miss Blackwood. Children grow up faster because they have to. She patted Eleanor's arm. And besides, worrying never kept anyone safe. Eleanor knew the older woman was right, but letting go of her concern proved difficult. Each day when she returned home to find Will safe and the chores completed, she felt a rush of relief followed by a twinge of guilt for doubting him. The boy never complained about his responsibilities, tackling each task with quiet determination. As September faded into October, the prairie transformed. Golden grasses rippled in the wind, and the cottonwoods along the creek turned brilliant yellow. The days grew shorter, the nights cooler, and Eleanor found herself watching the sky anxiously for signs of the winter storms she'd been warned about. "We should start preparing," she told Will one evening as they sat by the fire. "Mrs. Hollister mentioned that we'll need at least 2 cords of wood to get through winter." Will nodded, poking at the embers with a stick. Pa usually started cutting in October, said it was better to have too much than too little. He glanced up at her. "I can show you where we cut last year," but he hesitated. "But what? But I can't use the axe very well yet. And Pa said I could try this year, but he was going to do most of it." Eleanor considered the problem. She had never wielded an axe in her life and doubted her ability to cut enough wood to last the winter. "Perhaps we could hire someone. One of the Miller boys." Will looked relieved at the suggestion. "Tom Miller helped Pa last year. He's strong. Then we'll speak to him after church on Sunday," Eleanor decided, making a mental note to check James's ledger to see if they could afford the expense. That night, Eleanor dreamed of Boston, of gaslit streets and brick houses, of bookshops and tea rooms, of her small apartment above Mrs. Fenton's millinery shop. She woke with a curious ache in her chest, a homesickness she hadn't allowed herself to feel since arriving in Montana. For a moment, lying in the darkness of her bedroom, she let herself imagine what her life might have been if she had never answered his advertisement. She would have continued teaching the Benson children, taking her meals in their kitchen and saving her meager salary for books and the occasional new bonnet. She would have visited her cousins on holidays, listening politely to Aunt Margaret's thinly veiled hints about suitable bachelors. She would have been safe, comfortable, and utterly alone. The thought brought her upright in bed. For all its challenges and uncertainties, her life here had purpose. Will needed her, not just as a guardian, but as someone who cared about his future, who read poetry with him in the evenings, who marveled at his whittling skills and laughed at his rare jokes. And she realized with some surprise, needed him just as much. The following Sunday, after the church service, Eleanor approached Tom Miller about cutting wood for the winter. He was a sturdy young man of perhaps 17, with the same red hair as his younger brother Robert. "I'd be happy to help, Miss Blackwood," he said, removing his hat respectfully. "Mr. Everett always paid fair, and I was sorry to hear of his passing." They agreed on a price, and Tom promised to begin the following weekend. As they were concluding their arrangement, Sheriff Harding approached, his expression unusually grave. "Miss Blackwood, might I have a word?" Eleanor nodded, a flutter of apprehension in her chest. "Of course, Sheriff." He led her away from the dispersing congregation toward the shade of a large oak tree. "I received a telegram yesterday," he said without preamble, "from Thomas Everett." Eleanor's heart seemed to stutter in her chest. "Oh, what did it say?" The sheriff removed a folded paper from his pocket. It was brief. "He acknowledges receipt of our message about James's passing and his guardianship of Will." He hesitated. "He says he'll be making arrangements to come for the boy within the month." The words struck Eleanor like a physical blow. She had known this was a possibility. Indeed, it was the expected outcome of the temporary guardianship arrangement. Yet somehow, in the daily rhythm of life with Will, she'd allowed herself to imagine a different future. "I see," she said, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. "Has Will been informed?" Sheriff Harding shook his head. "I thought it best, coming from you." Eleanor glanced across the churchyard to where Will stood with the Miller boys, laughing at something Tom had said. His face, usually so serious, was transformed by the rare smile, making him look like the child he truly was beneath his responsibilities. "Thank you, Sheriff. I'll tell him when the time is right." All the way home, Eleanor rehearsed what she would say, how she would would prepare Will for this new change in his life, but each attempt felt inadequate. How did one tell a child who had already lost so much that he would soon be uprooted again, taken from the only home he had ever known by an uncle he barely remembered? By the time they reached the homestead, she had decided to wait. There was no need to burden Will with this knowledge immediately. Thomas Everett was still weeks away, and much could happen in that time. Perhaps he would change his mind. Perhaps there would be delays in his journey. Perhaps, Miss Blackwood, Will's voice interrupted her thoughts as they unsaddled Penny. Are you all right? You've been awful quiet. Eleanor forced a smile. Just thinking about all we need to do before winter comes. Will nodded seriously. Pa always said planning ahead is what separates those who make it from those who don't. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Will suddenly asked, "If Uncle Thomas comes, will you go back to Boston?" Eleanor froze, her cup of tea halfway to her lip. "What makes you ask that?" Will kept his eyes on the horizon, where the sky was painted in brilliant oranges and pinks. "Sheriff Harding was talking to you about him today. I saw him show you a paper." He glanced at her briefly. "Is Uncle Thomas coming to get me?" Eleanor set down her cup, her heart heavy with the realization that her attempt to protect Will had failed. "He's indicated that he intends to," she said carefully, "but nothing is certain yet." Will nodded, absorbing this information with the same stoic acceptance he had shown to all of life's hardships. "And if he does, will you leave?" It was the same question he had asked her on the train platform that first day, though the context had shifted dramatically. Would she stay if she had known about him? Would she leave once he was gone? "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "I've signed a contract to teach for the full term, but after that," she trailed off, unwilling to make promises she might not be able to keep. Will was silent for a long moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I wish Pa had married you before he died. Then Uncle Thomas couldn't take me away." Will's words hung in the air between them, so honest and heartfelt that Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. She reached out and placed her hand over his small, calloused one. "Oh, Will," she said softly, "I wish that too." The admission surprised her even as she spoke it. It was true, she realized. In the weeks since her arrival, this cabin had become home in a way her Boston apartment never had. And Will, this solemn, resilient child who had endured so much loss, had worked his way into her heart with his quiet determination and rare, precious smiles. Will looked up at her, hope flaring briefly in his eyes before the familiar guardedness returned. "Uncle Thomas isn't like Pa," he said flatly. "He's loud and he drinks whiskey. He made Pa angry when he visited after Ma died." Eleanor considered this new information carefully. "Sometimes people change, Will. It's been several years since you last saw him." "I don't want to go to California," Will said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "I don't want to leave our place." Eleanor squeezed his hand gently. "I understand. This is your home. It's your home too now," Will replied with surprising fierceness. "Pa wanted you here." The simple statement touched Eleanor deeply. Yes, he did. They sat in silence as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared, each lost in their own thoughts. Eventually, Eleanor sighed and stood. "It's getting chilly. We should go inside." Will nodded but remained seated, staring out at the darkening prairie. "Can I stay out a bit longer, just till the moon rises?" Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. Not too long. There's school tomorrow." Inside, she busied herself with preparations for the next day, laying out clothes, packing lunches, reviewing her lesson plans, but her mind kept returning to Will's words and the uncertain future they faced. If Thomas Everett came for Will, what would become of her? The teaching position would continue, of course, but the thought of returning each day to an empty cabin, of no longer seeing Will's serious face across the breakfast table or hearing his quiet breathing from the next room as she fell asleep, created a hollow ache in her chest. When Will finally came inside, his cheeks flushed with cold, Eleanor was sitting at the kitchen table with James's ledger open before her. She had been reviewing their finances, trying to determine if there might be some legal way to contest Thomas's guardianship if it came to that. The prospects seemed bleak. "Find anything interesting?" Will asked, hanging his jacket on the hook by the door. Eleanor closed the ledger with a sigh. Your father was very organized. Will nodded. He said a man who knows where his money goes is a man who keeps his money. He hesitated. And I've been saving too, from the eggs we sell to Mrs. Miller. Have you? What for? Will shrugged, suddenly interested in the pattern of the floorboards. Thought maybe we could get those blue curtains Pa was always talking about for the kitchen window. The mention of the curtains, that detail from James's letters that had first captured Eleanor's imagination, brought a lump to her throat. That's a lovely idea, Will. The boy nodded, seemingly relieved by her response. Good night, Miss Blackwood. Good night, Will. Later, lying in bed, Eleanor stared at the ceiling, her mind racing with possibilities. Could she contest Thomas's guardianship? On what grounds? She was not a blood relative, merely a woman who had arrived too late to marry the boy's father. The law would surely favor the uncle, regardless of Will's preferences, unless the thought that formed in her mind was so outlandish, so improper, that she initially dismissed it, but it returned, persistent and increasingly plausible as the night wore on. What if there was a way to create a legal tie to Will that even Thomas couldn't contest? The following day dawned grey and chilly, with a sharp wind that spoke of approaching winter. Eleanor and Will completed their morning chores in comfortable silence, each preoccupied with their own thoughts. As they prepared to leave for school, Eleanor took a deep breath. Will, I've been thinking about what you said last night, about your uncle. The boy's face immediately closed, his expression becoming carefully neutral. Yes, Mom, I want you to know that regardless of what happens, I will do everything in my power to ensure your wishes are considered. She adjusted his collar, a gesture that had become natural over the weeks. Your happiness matters to me very much. Will nodded, his eyes suspiciously bright. Thank you, Miss Blackwood. At school, Eleanor found it difficult to concentrate on her lessons. Her mind kept returning to the half-formed plan that had taken shape during the night. It was unconventional, perhaps even scandalous by Eastern standards, but this was the frontier where practical solutions often trumped social niceties. During the noon break, as Will prepared to return to the homestead, Eleanor impulsively called him aside. Will, would you mind taking a note to Mrs. Hollister on your way home? I'd like to speak with her this evening if possible. The boy nodded, clearly curious, but too well-mannered to ask questions. Yes, ma'am. Eleanor hastily penned a note requesting Mrs. Hollister's advice on a matter of some delicacy and sealed it with a drop of wax from the schoolroom candle. Thank you, she said, handing it to Will. I'll see you this evening. The afternoon dragged interminably. Eleanor found herself stumbling over simple arithmetic and misspeaking during the history lesson, earning confused looks from her students. By the time the final bell rang, she was nearly vibrating with nervous energy. She walked home more briskly than usual, her mind still turning over the possibilities. The sight of Mrs. Hollister's wagon outside the cabin sent her heart racing. This conversation would either confirm the viability of her plan or expose it as the desperate fantasy it might well be. Mrs. Hollister was seated at the kitchen table when Eleanor entered, a cup of coffee steaming before her. Will was nowhere to be seen. I sent the boy to return a pie plate to the Millers, Mrs. Hollister explained, noting Eleanor's questioning glance. Figured you wanted to speak privately. Given the tone of your note, Eleanor nodded gratefully, removing her bonnet and shawl. Yeah, thank you. Well, what's this delicate matter that has you looking like you've seen a ghost? Eleanor took a steadying breath. Sheriff Harding informed me yesterday that Thomas Everett intends to come for Will within the month. Mrs. Hollister nodded, unsurprised. Expected as much. Man's his uncle, after all. Will doesn't want to go, Eleanor continued. He barely remembers his uncle, and California would mean leaving behind everything familiar. His home, his school, his friends. Life's full of unwanted changes, Mrs. Hollister said, though her tone was sympathetic rather than dismissive, especially for children. Eleanor sat down opposite the older woman, gathering her courage. I've been thinking, what if there was a way to create a legal tie to Will that might supersede Thomas's claim, or at least provide grounds to contest it? Mrs. Hollister's eyebrows rose. What sort of legal tie did you have in mind? Adoption. The word hung in the air between them, bold and irrevocable once spoken. If I were to adopt Will legally before Thomas arrives, Mrs. Hollister studied her thoughtfully. That's a serious step, Miss Blackwood, one that can't be undone. I understand that. Do you? Adopting a child means taking responsibility for them for life, their education, their upbringing, their future. It's not a temporary arrangement. I don't want a temporary arrangement, Eleanor said firmly. I care deeply for Will. In the short time I've known him, he's become, she hesitated, searching for the right words. He's become family to me. Mrs. Hollister's weathered face softened slightly. I believe you mean that. But there's more to consider. You're an unmarried woman with limited means. The courts might not look favorably on your petition, especially with a blood relative claiming guardianship. But if I could prove that remaining here is in Will's best interest, it's not just about what's best for Will, Mrs. Hollister interrupted gently. It's about what the law recognizes, and the law tends to favor blood ties over emotional ones. Eleanor's shoulders slumped. Then what can I do? I can't bear the thought of Will being taken from everything he knows and loves. Mrs. Hollister was silent for a long moment, her weathered hands cupped around her coffee mug. When she finally spoke, her voice held a thoughtfulness that caught Eleanor's attention. There might be another way, she said slowly. Though it's nearly as unorthodox as your adoption plan. Eleanor leaned forward eagerly. I'm willing to consider any possibility. Judge Wilson returns next month, Mrs. Hollister continued. If you were to petition for a hearing regarding Will's guardianship, it would at least delay any immediate action by Thomas Everett. But wouldn't the judge likely rule in favor of the blood relative? Mrs. Hollister nodded. Under normal circumstances, yes, but Montana Territory law has some peculiarities. One being that if a child over the age of 7 expresses a strong preference for a particular guardian and can demonstrate that their welfare would be better served by that arrangement, the judge has considerable discretion. Hope flickered in Eleanor's chest. So if Will were to tell the judge he wants to stay with me, it wouldn't guarantee anything, Mrs. Hollister cautioned. But it might sway Judge Wilson, especially if you can show you've established a stable home for the boy, that you're contributing to the community as a teacher, that uprooting him would cause unnecessary distress. Eleanor nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. We would need witnesses, people who could testify to Will's well-being in my care. I'd speak for you, Mrs. Hollister said without hesitation. And so would Sheriff Harding, I expect, and Mr. Taylor from the school board. For the first time since hearing of Thomas Everett's impending arrival, Eleanor felt a glimmer of hope. Thank you, Mrs. Hollister, for everything. The older woman waved away her gratitude. That boy deserves some stability after all he's lost. And you, she studied Eleanor with shrewd eyes. You've changed since you arrived, grown stronger. James would have been pleased. The following weeks passed in a flurry of preparation. Eleanor consulted with Sheriff Harding, who agreed to delay Thomas Everett's visit until after Judge Wilson's next circuit court session. She gathered letters of support from Mr. Taylor and Reverend Collins, testifying to her character and Will's improved demeanor since coming under her care. Mrs. Hollister spread word throughout the community, and several families whose children attended the school offered their endorsement. Throughout it all, Will watched with wary hope, his solemn face brightening whenever another letter of support arrived or a neighbor stopped by with encouraging words. He threw himself into his schoolwork and chores with renewed vigor, as if proving his worth might somehow influence the outcome. Do you think it will work? He asked one evening, as they sat by the fire, the wind howling outside the cabin walls. The first snow had fallen that afternoon, dusting the prairie in white. Eleanor hesitated, unwilling to offer false assurances. I don't know, Will, but we're going to try our very best. The boy nodded, returning his attention to the wooden figure he was carving, another horse, this one more detailed than the last. A Pa always said a man makes his own luck by being prepared when opportunity comes. The wisdom in the statement, delivered in Will's matter-of-fact tone, made Eleanor smile despite her anxiety. Your father sounds wiser every time you quote him. He was, Will agreed simply, and then after a pause, but he would have learned from you too. He said your letters made him think about things differently. This was new information, another precious glimpse into James's thoughts. Did he? How so? Will shrugged, focused on his carving. Just that you asked questions he'd never considered, about books and ideas and such. He glanced up briefly. He said you made him want to be better. The words touched Eleanor deeply. In her darkest moments, she sometimes wondered if James had truly wanted her, or merely the idea of a wife. any wife, to help with his home and child. This small insight suggested something more meaningful, a connection that might have grown into genuine love had fate allowed. The day of Judge Wilson's arrival dawned clear and cold, the November sun glinting off fresh snow. Eleanor and Will rode into town together, both dressed in their Sunday best. The journey felt symbolic somehow. One final trip together before their future was decided by forces beyond their control. Sheriff Harding met them outside his office, his expression grave but not unkind. Thomas Everett arrived on yesterday's stage, he informed them quietly. He's staying at the hotel. Eleanor's heart sank. She had hoped for more time, for the judge to rule before Will's uncle appeared to complicate matters. Has he been informed of today's hearing? Yes, ma'am. He'll be there. Inside, the sheriff's office had once again been transformed into a makeshift courtroom. Several familiar faces nodded encouragingly as Eleanor and Will took their seats. Mrs. Hollister, Mr. Taylor, Reverend Collins. At the far side of the room sat a broad-shouldered man with a thick mustache and the same distinctive jawline as James and Will Thomas Everett. He studied Eleanor with undisguised curiosity, but made no move to approach. Judge Wilson entered promptly at 10 o'clock, his manner as grave and considerate as Eleanor remembered. He reviewed the documents before him, occasionally glancing up at Will, who sat straight back beside Eleanor, his face a careful mask. This is an unusual case, the judge began. I have before me two competing guardianship claims for William Everett, one from his uncle, Mr. Thomas Everett, as specified in his late father's will, the other a petition from Miss Eleanor Blackwood, the boy's current temporary guardian, requesting that arrangement be made permanent. He looked at Will directly. Young man, you are of an age where your preferences carry some weight. Do you have anything you wish to say before I hear from the adults involved? Will stood, his small hands clasped behind his back in a posture Eleanor recognized as his way of hiding nervousness. Yes, Your Honor, I'd like to stay with Miss Blackwood, if that's possible. She's been teaching me just like Pa would have, and she takes good care of our place. I see. Judge Wilson's expression remained neutral. And Dan, do you have any objections to living with your uncle? Will hesitated, clearly choosing his words carefully. I don't really know my uncle, sir, and California is very far from home. Thank you, William. You may sit. The judge turned his attention to Thomas Everett. Mr. Everett, would you care to address the court? Thomas rose, clearing his throat awkwardly. He was younger than Eleanor had expected, perhaps 35, with a weathered face that spoke of outdoor work. Your Honor, I came as soon as I received word of my brother's passing. James and I had our differences, but he named me guardian for a reason. He glanced at Will. The boy is my nephew, my blood. I have a good situation in California, steady work as a foreman at a lumber mill, a house with room for him. I can provide. Judge Wilson nodded. And Miss Blackwood, your statement. Eleanor stood, her heart pounding but her voice steady. Your Honor, I came to Silver Creek to marry James Everett. Fate prevented that, but it brought me into Will's life instead. In the months since, we have built a home together. I have secured employment as the town's teacher. Will is thriving in school and maintaining his father's homestead with pride. She paused, gathering her courage. I may not be blood, but I love that boy as if he were my own, and I believe James would have wanted him to stay where he's happy, where his roots are deep. For over an hour, the judge heard testimony from Mrs. Hollister about Eleanor's dedication to learning frontier skills, from Mr. Taylor about Will's academic progress, from Thomas Everett about his plans for Will's future in California. Throughout, Will sat silently, his eyes moving between the adults who were deciding his fate. Finally, Judge Wilson raised his hand. I've heard enough. This is not a simple matter, but the law provides some guidance. The welfare of the child must be my primary concern. He looked directly at Will. Young man, I have one final question. When Miss Blackwood first arrived in Silver Creek, I understand you asked her something important. Would you tell me what that was? Will looked startled, then thoughtful. I asked if she would still have come if she'd known about me, and what was her answer? She said yes. Will's voice strengthened with certainty, and she meant it. Judge Wilson nodded slowly. Mr. Everett, I believe your intentions are honorable, but I am persuaded that William's best interests lie in maintaining the stability he has found. with Miss Blackwood. He signed the document before him with a flourish. Guardianship is hereby granted to Eleanor Blackwood, with the provision that William maintain correspondence with his uncle if he so chooses. The room erupted in murmurs. Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes as Will's hand found hers, squeezing tightly. Across the room, Thomas Everett's expression was unreadable. After a moment, he approached them, hat in hands. "Miss Blackwood," he said quietly, "take good care of my nephew." Eleanor nodded, unable to speak through her emotion. Will looked up at his uncle, then stepped forward and extended his hand solemnly. "You're welcome to visit Uncle Thomas when you want to." Thomas seemed surprised by the gesture, but shook Will's hand with a faint smile. "I'd like that, William." Later, as they rode home through the snow-covered landscape, Will broke the comfortable silence. "Miss Blackwood, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Would it be all right if I called you Ma sometimes? Not all the time, just sometimes." Eleanor's heart swelled with emotion. "I would be honored, Will." The boy nodded, satisfied. "I think Pa would like that. Us being a family." As the homestead came into view, golden light spilling from its windows against the darkening sky, Eleanor felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. This was not the life she had traveled west to find, but perhaps it was the life she was meant to have all along. "Yes," she said softly, "I think he would."